everyone. Thank you for joining another What the Heck podcast powered by RadicalX. Today, we're going to be talking about product design, and we're really delighted to have Asaad Mahmood here, or Asaad Mahmood. He's a senior UX designer at Mattermost. A lot of people probably already know about Mattermost because in one of our polls, we were talking about collaboration tools, and a lot of people recommended that. He's also the founder and CEO of Square, which is Upwork's top rated agency. I'm not going to talk about more of Asaad here. He's going to kind of do his introduction. But before we begin, I would request you all to add your name, bio, and location in the chat so that we know who our amazing audience is. So today we're really going to be focusing on product design. There are going to be kind of, parts where we talk about UX and UI and kind of the intersection. So there are a number of really interesting kind of details, but we are going to be keeping this super high level. And the idea is for folks who are starting their careers, we really want to make this an easy kind of process to understand. So with that, feel free to kind of, add those details in the poll, and we're going to be starting in a couple minutes here. But yeah, Asaad, how's everything going?
Yeah, it's going good. It's going terrific. I'm glad to see again participants from or attendees from a lot of different regions. So obviously that's going to make the conversation a bit more diverse. I don't really want to talk too much about myself since you've already given an introduction. But one thing that I think you may have not pointed out is I'm also a YouTuber. So some people may know me from there as well. So yeah, but we can get into it.
All right, amazing. So let's kind of kick this off. So Asaad, is there a stereotype about product designers that's true?
So I would assume that there are tons. And first of all, again, the definition of a product designer varies from company to company, from a person to person, even sometimes from region to region. So whether the stereotype specifically applies to every particular product designer, I think that stereotype may be different. But usually, I think the stereotype that I personally have faced when it comes to product design and all of that stuff is, first of all, that a product designer is someone who's actually just focused on the user as well, and then obviously delivering the business objectives as well. So that stereotype particularly, I wouldn't say is necessarily wrong, but that usually is not the case. So again, this comes back to us demystifying the UX concepts and all of those things, because the fact is what a product designer is in an organization may vary. There is no universal global definition of what a product designer's responsibilities are, because again, it may depend on the company requirements. It may depend on where you want to pitch in to actually contribute to the success of a particular product or any experience in general. So yeah, I just want to mention that the stereotype would be that there is no strict definition.
All right, amazing. So let's kind of start with your design journey, because I know you've been doing a number of different things. So you started out as a visual and a web designer, and then you basically, started designing an open source platform for developer collaboration, right, at Mattermost, and you're also managing a top-ranked Upwork agency. So tell us a little bit about your experience and how you got started in product design. Yeah.
So initially, I think I would argue that I started out as a web designer. I would even argue probably back mostly a decade back, I was even designing some logos and stuff and all of those things. But usually as you scale and start working on these things, you realize that there is definitely a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room for contribution to make an impact, so on and so forth. So from logo design and graphic designs and all of that stuff, and particularly print design, I went to web design. And then from web design, we know obviously the scale at which applications are growing and their adoption, obviously, and how fastly, again, that has grown over time. So I personally felt again, it was time to actually shift from web design and go into application design. So even though generally on my LinkedIn profile or maybe on my Upwork profile, people may not necessarily know the tons of jobs that I've done over these years, but it's way more than just, again, transitioning from a visual designer to just designing an open source platform. Even though I have worked with Mattermost for about 7 years or maybe more, but there has been a lot of other stuff that I've done in the middle. So again, it has contributed or ranged from, I guess, anything that you can imagine possibly in the design sphere. But again, I landed particularly on the app design part or product design, particularly because, again, it has the most influence, I believe, again, in the time and age that we live in. So again, that's what I'm focusing on. As far as it comes to me, particularly working on Mattermost as an open source application, It happened because I was initially a web designer and I worked with Ian. So Ian is the CEO of Mattermost. So I initially worked with Ian on a product or on a website that they had, and we had a great relationship. So again, I worked on that particular end, and then we just split. So again, like obviously that was a part-time project. I worked on it. They went off, but again, they really liked again, and I guess like it was a mutual understanding as well, and a mutual beneficial relationship that actually provoked him, I guess, like to come back and contact me about joining Mattermost as the first designer of Mattermost, basically. So yeah, that's how the journey started. So I just want to mention, I guess, like that point as well, which may not be again realize that some opportunities, no matter how small, may actually lead to perhaps some of the biggest opportunities that you have in your career. And even though that was web design, and this is completely separate, this is an application design, but they contacted me because of the positive relationship that we previously had in that short-term project. So that's how it all scaled up, and here I am.
Yeah, no, amazing. And definitely kind of keeping those relationships and those bridges like that they really kind of go a long way. So tell us a little bit about your Upwork agency. I mean, when I first contacted you, that's how I basically found you, right? Through Upwork, we were looking for a UX designer for a company that I was working with in San Francisco. And in the last couple of years or so, you've made $1 million on that. So a lot of people probably have a lot of questions on, how you managed to really kind of grow that business. So yeah, shed some light on that.
Okay, so definitely that's a complete story of its own. And we may actually, as I mentioned previously, we may do a podcast on that separately dedicated as well. But I guess like, as I initially mentioned, so apart from obviously doing all of the other work that I was doing, I was also running my own profile on Upwork. And that's what I usually was doing at the beginning. I did not have an agency, but since I was making a lot of money, I was actually securing a lot of clients. I did not have the resources to actually manage all of that stuff. And obviously working with Mattermost that I've been doing for about like 7 years now, I don't really have a lot of time that I can actually invest obviously serving the clients that want to work with me. So I needed to scale and not only scale just for my own benefit, but to obviously contribute positively to the clients that actually want to work with me or work with like-minded individuals like myself. That's where I thought, like, if I actually have to, again, serve the clients that really want to work with me, I actually have to bring together like-minded people like me, talented people like me, and then form something that can actually help them on the side. And I can be obviously a contributing factor in there, but it can also be like, again, stuff that I can actually delegate to some other talented individuals as well. And that's why I actually formed this agency, so I can serve those clients in a much scalable manner, because obviously there's so much that a person can do, right? A single individual can't really do everything by himself. And even if they do, there's going to be a limit at to which they can scale. And I was hitting that plateau, which is why, again, I just formed that agency, started hiring really great talent, and obviously still exploring talent. So obviously, if anyone's interested, anyone has a great portfolio, I know we probably talk about portfolio as well, so they can definitely reach out as well. So that's how it happened.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that I keep on telling people, that you don't even know where opportunities are going to come from. So definitely stay in touch with people on podcasts and stuff. So we'll definitely talk about that. But let's talk some UX now and some product design. So product design, UX design, it's pretty complex. It also kind of varies industry by industry. You really got to understand the domain. There are a lot of variables, right? And yeah, so my question is really, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face as a product designer day in and day out working on these products? Yeah.
So initially, as I mentioned, there is usually a stereotype about product designers that product designers are more involved in the business objectives as well. And I would say that's true to some extent. Obviously, it may differ, but that is true in some of the organizations that I work for. And one of the struggle that you have as a product designer, which you usually don't have as an isolated UX designer. By isolated, I mean you usually get a task to design something, to design an experience. You obviously go to talk to people. You think about like what best approach you can take to design that particular experience, and you design it. When you're a product designer, you obviously have to sometimes navigate between the business requirements. You obviously have to consider the stakeholders. You have to consider the investors that are investing in the product. And sometimes you have to make compromises. And as much as I don't like making compromises on behalf of user experience, that's something that is something that people may eventually have to make. So again, I know that a particular feature, as an example, may work in a particular manner that's beneficial to the user the most. But the time and cost that it takes for us to actually go in that direction is quite a lot, right? So we have to manage feasibility as well, along with providing users an optimal experience. So obviously, when you're thinking about that optimal experience, you have to navigate and balance out all of these other requirements as well and expectations. And that's usually when you have a struggle and a conflict, both internally and then obviously externally as well. There's some pushback and all of that stuff. So I think when we're talking about struggles, and it's not necessarily a struggle, I would say it's just a way to grow as well, to navigate, to again communicate, to balance out and everything. I think that's probably going to be the most important challenge, I would say, if you're actually a leading product designer in any organization, to balance out those things. It's not just about you saying, hey, this is the best experience that can actually be out there, and we're going to design this. That usually does not happen in a real organization. As much as we would like that to happen, that doesn't necessarily happen. Obviously, we have limited resources, we have limited time. If people keep on thinking about the perfect experience, they're not going to get anywhere. And they may not even come up with a perfect experience. They're just going to keep on realizing one thing after the other, and it's just going to be an endless cycle. So we have to stop somewhere. We have to release something, considering obviously all of these other requirements that come in, and balance things out.
Yeah, definitely. And a few kind of quick takeaways here. I mean, design's always in beta. There's always something that's improving.
Yep.
You should never kind of go with that. But I think the second big thing over here is you're not just kind of designing for desirability. You got to keep in mind feasibility and viability, because end of the day, it is a business. And I think this is where a lot of UX designers struggle, right? They make the ideal product from a user's perspective, which is important, but there's no kind of viability there. So I think really, really valid points. So for people who are starting out, they have all sorts of misconceptions about what UX designers, product designers do on a day-to-day basis, right? They kind of have this thing where they're thinking about, the Apple design team, that video. But what does your day-to-day look like? I mean, what are your roles and responsibilities that matter most? Yeah, if you could kind of talk about that.
Sure. So initially, when I started out with Mattermost was a communication application, like a chat application, similar to what you would imagine, like Slack or Discord and stuff along those lines. So that's what I was usually focusing on, because that was the initial product that we were focusing on. But now Mattermost is evolving into more of a suite-based application, where we have different types of products. Not only chat application, like not only like the channel side of things, which actually is the communication side of things, but now we have team collaboration as well. So within team collaboration and within the larger perspective of team collaboration, we have things like playbooks. Playbooks can be used for incident resolution or automating certain tasks and actually creating certain ways of doing things, certain patterns of doing things, and making them repeatable quite easily. And then we have boards as well. So I've actually been on all three teams. We also have calls now. So again, you can have your own calls within Mattermost, and they are much more, again, lightweight than Zoom. So they don't occupy a lot of resources. But again, we have all of these products. So I initially worked on channels, then I worked on the playbooks team, as I mentioned, and now currently I'm actually working at boards. And my day-to-day working at boards is, again, just working with PMs, working with developers, working with the organization and other designers who are now on the channel team, who are on the other calls team, playbooks team, obviously working together and getting different perspectives as to how to actually not only just improve the boards product, which is my responsibility, but obviously contributing to Mattermost as a whole, in conjunction with all of the designers, and just, again, working along with them to improve all of these verticals separately, and obviously in conjunction as well. Yeah,
that's amazing. And we'll definitely touch on the collaboration piece in more detail in a few minutes. But tell us about some of the most interesting projects that you worked on recently, whether at Mattermost or your freelancing work.
Yeah. So when it comes to the freelancing work, as many of you know, like Upwork, usually projects on Upwork are behind an NDA until and unless obviously people explicitly allow you to do something or share that particular project and all of that stuff. But recently I have been working with I think a while back, I actually worked with Viper, which is actually an application that allows police officers and, again, like owners who are of particular security agencies, so on and so forth, to actually track vehicles and their numbers, and, again, make sure, again, if there's any particular suspicious activities going on, so on and so forth. So again, these are not just like any individual can sign up and actually just start tracking any cars or anything. These are specific individuals who are responsible for these things. So again, to prevent crime, to prevent, again, and to catch criminals sometime and all of that stuff. So again, it's a real-time application where people can have a real-time view which is, again, it's a really complicated application where people can actually see snapshots of cars, of people actually coming in from, let's say, images being taken by the cameras to track certain vehicles and all of that stuff. So it's really fascinating. It's obviously very complicated as well, which is something that I think was quite interesting. And it's not something that I've done before. So.
All right, amazing. So my next kind of thing over here really is around design process, because when people start out, they have this kind of textbook definition of the 5 stages. But one of the things that I've seen is what's important is the right mindset, right? Really understanding how these processes work. There's no kind of fixed way of working. So what I'm really kind of trying to get at right now is really understand your mindset and understand how you kind of go about your design process when you're starting a project for the first time, and what are some of the methods that you follow.
Yeah, I think it usually, again, as you just mentioned, and you rightly mentioned it, so that there is no strict process. Like, it actually depends on the particular thing that you're working on. If, for example, as an example, like anyone can think about a basic example here. If I'm working on a feature that just introduces a button on a application, like that is a feature, right? That is an enhancement, or whatever you call it. Like, that is a particular feature. You're not going to do tons of research. You're not going to go into like the groundwork, do primary research, secondary research, and all of that. Obviously, that does not involve a lot of insights. Like, it does obviously still require us testing at the basic level, whether the positioning of that button is fine, so on and so forth. But it's not going to be as rigorous as a completely new feature or completely new vertical if we were to introduce that in Mattermost. So the process actually depends on the application, on the feature, on anything that you're actually exactly working on, and the scale of it as well. But if we generally have to think about it, I would argue that even if people have a textbook definition of the design thinking methodology, it's not necessarily wrong, because if they have a good understanding of it, they know that it's a non-linear iterative process. So it's a non-linear process. So it's not like you always have to start with one particular stage and then go to the next and then go to the next. No. If your project is currently in design, it's in development, whatever it is, you can actually start from that particular stage and then obviously go. If you feel like there's a lot more research that needs to be done, you can go back. Or if you feel like there is sufficient research that someone else has done, or maybe there are time constraints where it may not be feasible to actually do that research right now. You may actually do that after you've actually initially released it for users to get their hands on. So it's a nonlinear process where you keep on learning, you keep on pushing out things, and you keep on learning again and again. However, with that particular thing in mind, I would say this particular idea of releasing things and testing them out has definitely a bearing on users, because it increases the cognitive load that they have if you have to go back on a certain feature that you've introduced to them and they don't really like it, or you've introduced something that's not really beneficial to them. So again, it has a cost. So obviously it's better if you actually analyze those things beforehand, you do the testing beforehand. But sometimes, again, it's unavoidable. And sometimes even if you do testing beforehand, it may not fare well once it actually gets to people, once they actually have an extended period of time of using it, so on and so forth. I give the example of the touch bar, right? The touch bar on MacBooks, right? I'm pretty sure Apple did a ton of research when they were introducing that touch bar, but it did not fare well and they had to discontinue it from certain MacBook Pro models. And that's fine. Like, they innovate, they test, but sometimes things don't work out in the long end. And the same goes for other tons of Google products that have failed over time. But again, they keep on innovating, they keep on learning from them.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest learnings, because when I was working with Microsoft, I was kind of telling people, all of these big companies have labs where they have dead products, right? There are thousands and thousands of products that fail. Google has tried multiple times to do like a social media company. They failed, right? All time. So the idea is, even with all of those resources, all of that research, you can still fail, and that's part of the process. But at the same time, as you said, I think one of the things that I really kind of liked is that, especially with enterprise products, you have to be more careful, right? That's why I think beta programs really help, right? Really kind of making sure, because when you're really kind of making a B2B SaaS app and there are hundreds and thousands of customers, you definitely want to be really careful when you're kind of introducing new things, because there's a big cognitive load, but there's also a huge training kind of time and cost attached to that. So you touched on this a little bit, and I understand that, as we said, in the design process, depending on what we're designing, if it's an incremental kind of change, then obviously user research is going to be a little bit less. I mean, you don't have to do that. You can also use best principles there. But in terms of starting out a new project, especially for people who are starting out, a lot of questions that I get is, we've done a survey of 500 people. Do we still have to talk to people? Do we still have to interview people? Should we only make one persona? Do we have to really make three personas? And one of the biggest challenges that I see with people starting out in UX is that they kind of have that college mindset, but it kind of feels like a task or deliverable, that it's kind of like this homework thing where you have to do something versus not. So what is your take on the importance of user research, especially when we're ideating and we're developing something that's incredibly new?
So again, there are tons of methodologies and tons of best practices that you can follow, whether you want to do a user persona thing, or do you want to be a bit more diverse and you want to do something that's more testing out the users based on a spectrum. So again, it completely depends upon you, but user research by far is definitely, I would argue, one of the most important things that actually go into designing a product. But that does not mean that it needs to be intimidating. So again, it's more about empathizing with the user, understanding the user. How do you do that? That actually depends on that particular project. So for example, if I'm actually designing a project that does not exist right now, and I want to create a new thing that is going to fulfill a need for the user, I first need to obviously validate that need, whether that's a need, actual need of users, or it's my assumption that it's a need. Sometimes, for example, I was actually giving that example when I was giving a talk in my university. I was invited to Habib University to actually give a talk there. And we had a room, and there was another room there, quite a near distance, and obviously there was like a lot of sunlight and a lot of heat there. Now imagine if I was to design a particular cart, or like a small car that actually takes the user from one room to another. That may seem feasible in my mind. I'm like, hey, it's extremely hot again. I think this feature is going to really help. Or I may design a lift that's again going to take the user from the ground floor to the first floor. But again, if it's like compact and users can just climb the stairs, why would they need an expensive thing like a lift where they have to wait instead of, like, let's say, just going to their class quickly? So I have to understand that usually students need to actually go to their classes quickly. They have stairs. Again, stairs are also beneficial for their health. So I don't necessarily need to elevate that particular experience by introducing a lift, which is going to have not only harmful cost expenses, but it's also going to have an expense on their health. It's also going to have an expense on the institution. We also have to particularly put certain safeguarding measures, so on and so forth. So sometimes technology, some certain products, so on and so forth, don't necessarily need to be there. But how are you going to figure that out if you're going to talk to users, and when you're going to talk to users, when you're going to empathize with them, when you're going to see and realize whether the need that you think actually exists in real life, or is it just your abstraction and a construction that you've made in your mind that there's a need? So again, it's all of that. And then obviously, if a product exists and you're trying to improve that product, then the experience or the UX research methodology or the research methods that you use might be different. It may be an overt observation of them or a covert observation, so on and so forth. It may be just actually checking out how they interact with your product on a Zoom call, so on and so forth. It may be just having an interview with them and having them walk through about their experiences. And there can be like a diverse set of methods that you can use, but those methods are going to be defined by what you're actually willing to achieve from that particular research. You usually have sometimes a lot of different outcomes that you want to achieve. Why do you want to empathize with them? Is it to understand a need? Is it to understand a problem that they're having with your product? Is it to understand maybe just their day-to-day routine or something, and maybe see if there is a potential market that you want to capitalize on or introduce a product to? So all of those things and the research methods actually depend on what the outcomes are of that research and what you're looking to do. So again, it's no one thing that you have to do. You don't have to necessarily do a step-by-step process to actually achieve different outcomes. So the outcomes are going to obviously define what you actually need to get out of that research.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really important to understand. It's more about the mindset than the tools, right? What are we trying to achieve here, and what's the best and the most effective way, right? Because end of the day, especially with newer products, sometimes it's too early to ask customers, right? I mean, they just don't know what they need sometimes.
Yeah.
It's better to actually design something and then validate it afterwards. So My next question is really around psychology. And, one of the biggest kind of misconceptions that people have is that UX design is kind of it's an art and it's more of like a visual design process. But there's a lot of like a big scientific process over here. And a lot of good UX designers actually come from a social science background. They're curious people. They understand how people function. And I've seen a lot of your videos on YouTube around psychology. So just wanted to understand, in your opinion, how does understanding psychology make you a better product or UX designer?
I mean, for sure. Like if we understand like psychology as a study of human behavior, as an example, though obviously some people may conflate that with sociology as well, and that's fine. But generally, if it's more about understanding the human psyche, understanding like what are the reasons why they do certain things, what are their motivations, what are their desires, so on and so forth, then obviously you can capitalize on them. And I don't mean capitalization in a negative sense, but obviously you can use those ways of understanding the user to better understand them, to obviously give them what they want. If you don't have an understanding of human psyche, for example, how are you going to design a product that's going to be something that helps them achieve their goal? As an example, if I don't like, I'm just going to raise one psychological principle that is probably going to help some others think about this particular thing. If it's about, let's say, for example, recommendations, or for example, highlighting a particular point to actually convey to the user what's best for them. So imagine you go to a page where you have 5 different options or 3 different options or a pricing table, so on and so forth. Sometimes it's really hard for users to make decisions if you don't really inform them about the pros and cons, and you actually don't present them with a recommendation. So sometimes it's really beneficial to actually help them make that certain call by giving them a recommendation. You're going to help them make that particular call by not bombarding them with a lot of information and giving them a suggestion that, hey, we really suggest something like this, and then they can obviously make that decision on their own. So if you have an understanding that, for example, another example I want to give, if users can't really commute, or at the very least they can't really again consume a lot of information at the same time, it's really hard for them to actually keep all of that information in their working memory. So you're obviously going to break those things into different chunks, right? As an example, a lot of people actually may be familiarized with the US phone number pattern, right? And obviously different countries have different arrangements of phone numbers. But if you've noticed, there is a certain way in which those phone numbers are organized. Now imagine like if it's like, I'm just going to talk about my number and I'm not going to give it off right here. I don't want people to just start calling me. But if it's like 123-3456-789, as an example, it would be much easier for me to remember that particular number if it's distributed in these chunks as compared to if it was just like one single word, right? Or just a combination of those strings. So people remember these things much better in chunks. So that's just one example of how human psyche can help us better design products, better design experiences by understanding how the human psyche works, how they actually understand certain things. And as another example, if we know that people actually remember things by stories, by again, storytelling, so on and so forth. So it would be much better to actually introduce certain experiences or certain learning experiences that you want to introduce in your product by the art of storytelling, because we know that people learn by these stories. People learn and they actually remember a lot of things by the art of storytelling. So if we're introducing a certain feature, we may tell a story. If we're introducing a particular product, we may tell a story about it, and they may actually lean a bit more about it rather than just us sharing some numbers, which may seem good to us and may seem factual, but it may not really be as interesting for the user. So understanding the user psyche is going to help us better convey our point across, and obviously position ourselves in a way in which other users are going to have a really easy way to understand what we're delivering and how we can help them.
Yeah, that's amazing. So my next kind of theme is really around collaboration, and this is one of the things that is really unfortunate how universities and boot camps and online courses don't actually teach you, right? They just teach you the fundamentals of wireframing and prototyping, but in reality, a big part as a UX designer is being able to communicate customer stories, being able to collaborate with people who are engineers, who are product managers, and also having empathy for them and really kind of using a user-centered kind of approach there. So currently in our programs, we have thousands of people who are also coming from different cultures. This is also their first job, right? And I think the biggest kind of challenge that we see is around collaboration. So I have a few questions about that. So as a UX designer, how do you usually work with engineers and product managers, especially when they're working on tools that are basically not solving their own problems? They're really kind of, different. So yeah.
So I think that's a hugely misunderstood, and I wouldn't necessarily say misunderstood, but I guess like taken for granted concept. Like people don't really think about it as much. They actually think, again, they're going to learn that once they actually jump into an organization, so on and so forth. They don't really focus on it. But people skills, I would argue, are one of the most important skills, no matter what you're doing, whether it's UX design, whether it's like selling something on the road, whether it's marketing yourself, doing whatever, or actually just being a good human being a good listener, and just being very empathetic. Like if you don't have those people skills, interpersonal skills, then you're not going to get very far. Because imagine if we have Tala here, he's talking to me, I'm smiling, I'm communicating with him. If he was obviously asking me these questions and I was looking at a different screen, I was just answering like this. Yeah, I think product designers, yeah, obviously that's, yeah, makes sense, or something along those lines. Like it wouldn't feel engaging. Obviously, he would feel that he's not being appreciated, he's not being given importance, on and so forth. And that's going to throw people off. So it's really important to learn how to listen. And I would say it's not more important to actually speak, but to listen attentively, not listen to answer or to rebut certain things, but to actually listen attentively and understand the other person's perspective. I think that's the most important means, and perhaps the most important thing you have to realize when you're communicating with someone. It's not just about putting your point across, but more importantly, to understand the other person's perspective. And that is a bit hard when you're talking to engineers. You obviously don't have any idea what they're talking about. They're talking about JavaScript, they're talking about certain technical limitations, so on and so forth. And most of these things are just flowing out of your head. But I mean, it's really easy for you to just ask developers a question like, I don't really understand this, can you please explain? There's no shame in that. You don't have to assume that you understand something and then come back with a misunderstood understanding of what they just mentioned and just communicate that, or like just throw that out like, I don't really understand this particular thing, or you just mention your own opinion. So in order to actually have a productive team in general, you have to have some sort of an empathetic understanding of the other user, of the other person you're interacting with. And that only happens when you actually listen well and you try to deeply understand them, and obviously get your point across after you've understood their point. Otherwise, if you're just getting your point across without understanding them, it's not going to get very far. One thing I think that generally helps is develop a basic understanding of certain things, of certain technologies that people are working with. So for example, you don't necessarily have to have an understanding of backend languages, right? But if developers say that if something like this happens, then we need a migration. So if you have an idea that there's going to be a database migration, you can talk to them. How long is that going to take based on the data that's contained? They're going to be like, hey, that's going to take like 2 days or something. So next time a migration problem arises, you're going to have that at the back of your head, that when they mention this migration problem, it's basically because of the time that it's going to take, the cost it's going to have on the company, on the organization, and all of that stuff. And you don't have to just be clueless, like, what is this migration that you're talking about, and all of that stuff. Similarly, when you're talking with PMs on certain things, if they're talking about specs, they're talking about user stories, sometimes, again, it's not completely your responsibility. Sometimes PMs are helping with these things. But again, it's still, to a certain extent, your responsibility to learn about these things to better understand them. What is the user story? How is it being constructed? Why is it being constructed in a certain way? Why are specs being constructed in a certain way? And if, for example, sometimes PMs need my help to construct those specs, or actually at the very least fill out the developer requirements in those specs, I can be the person who can actually go ahead and do that, because I'm the most close to the design phase of things, on the experience phase of things. So obviously that's going to be your responsibility as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there are a number of really kind of good nuggets there. And I think one of the most important things that you kind of highlighted is that you don't need to know every single thing about every single team member or what they're doing, but you need to at least have enough knowledge that you can appreciate them, right? A
Yeah.
lot of UX designers don't understand anything about engineering. And then when they converse, right, it kind of clearly kind of seems, really, they're really clueless. The other big part, I think, is also being really, really kind of, curious, right? Whether it's a daily stand-up, if an engineer is giving, kind of a status update, ask them questions, ask them how it's done. And that's not only going to make you a better UX kind of designer, but also really kind of, help you get far. So my next question is, when you're working with multiple designers, everyone has their own process, everyone has their own approach. A lot of people are really opinionated in a team, right? But at the same time, end of the day, the idea is we're working for the customer. We're trying to have user impact. So how do you provide constructive feedback to team members in product design teams, right? Because especially with junior designers, because when people start out, I've also seen a lot of people get defensive, or they feel that we're personally blaming them for something, but we're just talking about the product. So yeah, talk a little bit about this, because we have a lot of people collaborating, and I think this is going to be really useful.
No, yeah, most definitely. One thing I want to mention, though, on the previous question is sometimes when new designers actually jump into organizations and they're working with engineers, so on and so forth, they propose an experience that they've seen on Dribbble. Sometimes they've seen on these professional, again, design sharing websites, which aren't really feasible. And sometimes, like some organizations, like I'm just going to mention Kuberto does like really great work in terms of like designs. They're really complex, so on and so forth. But they actually see these designs that are really, again, just an eye candy, and they expect their developers to actually work on them and to actually deliver a very similar experience. Now, we have to understand that there are different infrastructural problems. Like something that's possible on a website may not necessarily be possible on an application. Something that's possible on an application may not actually be possible on another application, because the infrastructure, the way that it's laid out, the way the structure of the page is laid out on a development end is very different. So instead of just saying, hey, I've already seen something like this done, like here's how to do it, like some people have already done it, try to understand and empathize with why developers think that it's going to be a problem, and trust your developers. Don't just think that, again, they're just doing it to escape doing work or anything along those lines. Just have a very trustful relationship, because if you don't trust them, they're not going to trust you. It's a mutual game. So that's the other thing I wanted to point out. Now, coming back to your question about engaging constructively, positively with the design team. So in my design team, again, we are thankfully very constructive, because obviously there is a certain way in which we do things. We have a member, Annalise, in our team as well. She actually introduced one concept as well quite recently, where we were doing a design sprint, and she mentioned that anytime someone actually mentions something or contributes something to a project, even if you disagree, don't really cut them off. Try to build on top of it. Instead of saying yes, but try to say yes, and. So if someone proposes something, don't say no, but. Don't just say no, but, or don't just say yes, but I don't think like that's going to work. Don't say that. If someone proposes something, you're going to say yes, and I think this is going to be even more impactful if we do certain things like this. So that may take that conversation forward, maybe sometimes to even a different direction, but it's not going to be oppositional. It's not going to be confrontational. If you say yes, but, obviously that means that you're downplaying the idea of that particular person. I just want to give credit to Annalise again, because he mentioned this particular thing, but those are just simple nuggets that you actually can use to have a more positive relationship. But apart from that, there are tons of other things that you can do. So the first thing that you can do is you can, first of all, give, as I mentioned, first of all, listen, try to understand and just think that if certain designers have made certain decisions, like for example, if a designer on my team has made a certain decision and I don't agree with it, I'm not going to say that I don't think that makes sense. I'm going to say, why have you made that particular decision? Can you explain that a bit more to me? They're going to explain that. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask them, have you considered this? And if they have not considered that, I'm going to give them that responsibility to consider that. And that after considering that, they may change it. Usually what happens is a designer comes up with a particular thing, and you realize that they've not considered one thing, which is going to change the output of that design. So instead of saying, I don't think that's going to work because you have not considered that, you're not going to say that. You're going to say, just have you considered that particular thing? I think that may be worth considering. And then they're going to consider it, and you trust them to actually come up with the right decision. And if they don't come up with the right decision, you can find out where it is exactly that you are misaligned. Like imagine if all of you have the same picture, have the same information, exact same information, it's really hard for you to come up with different conclusions. It's really hard to do that. Usually, if people are coming to a different conclusion, it's because there are missing pieces or there's a missing information, or perhaps there's a perspective that's not shared between you both. So it's more about sharing that perspective, more about sharing how you actually look at a particular thing, and put the onus back on the person who's actually working on it, rather than being downplaying their design or being obviously negatively constructive about it. So
Absolutely. And I think in UX design and design in general, the best ideas come from places that we aren't even expecting them from. So definitely try not to shut down ideas because everyone has their unique kind of perspective and experience. And I think that adds a lot of value. So, I mean, you probably work in a remote setting, right, with most of your clients and in my remotes, right? And I think the biggest challenge that people face when they're starting out their first UX job, I mean, it's a new job in itself, and then remote collaboration, how do I work across time zones? Oh, but that's too late for me. And it's all about compromise, right? It's the end of the day, you are making that effort. So what are some tips that you would give for remote UX design collaboration, especially when people are working in different, across different time zones?
So I'll just mention that one thing that obviously you mentioned Mattermost and you work with offshore clients, so on and so forth. But even in my own agency, I work remotely with people. I actually like a remote first or remote based culture. Obviously, I have employees that previously worked in offices, but I just don't like the fact that they have to commute. They don't have to be comfortable. They have to dress in a particular manner to actually be productive, so on and so forth. I don't mind them working from their bed if they're being productive, if they're delivering their goals, so on and so forth, and whenever they are delivering them. But I think one of the most important things is it's really beneficial to actually know people at a very personal level. Like usually in remote organization, that is a bit hard to do. So obviously, again, if you're communicating remotely, again, I don't know much about your personal life. I don't know much about like what's going on in your life, so on and so forth. So it's really important to actually have certain meetings just to catch up, just to know the person more personally rather than just professionally. So that's one, especially if you're in a manager and an employee relationship, so on and so forth, or even if you're, let's say, working with different colleagues, so on and so forth. One other thing I'd just like to point out, however, is even if you're working with, let's say, different people, different clients, so on and so forth, try to have meetings with them. So I know that, again, there's people frown upon like having excessive meetings, so on and so forth. You don't need to have excessive meetings, but you need to have meetings in order to understand people. You can't really just keep on communicating on chat and expect to have a clear understanding of what they're trying to say. Sometimes, again, if they mention something and you don't understand it, you can just say, hey, do you want to jump on a quick call? So a lot of people actually, sometimes they're communicating on chat and there is a difference in time zone, but they're perfectly fine communicating on chat, but they don't actually want to have a video call. Be comfortable having video calls with clients, be comfortable having video calls with your colleagues, be comfortable having just video calls with just about anyone, because you can only communicate so much emotion in a text, right? I can communicate a certain emotion by a GIF. Obviously, people use GIFs, right, to communicate certain things. Now, imagine if I was just talking through GIFs right now. Tala asked me a question, I'm like posting a GIF. I'm posting another GIF. That's a constrained medium. Like I wouldn't be able to communicate a lot of emotions. Now, imagine if I turn my video off, if I turn my gestures off, so on and so forth, that's going to restrain the emotion and the aspects of this conversation a lot more. If I, again, enable the video, I enable everything. And maybe in the future, if we have other forms of engagement as well, like again, AI robot touching your hand, so on and so forth, that's going to be so weird. Like it's going to communicate another sense of connection and feeling. So definitely, again, try to be as communicative, as elaborative, and again, as present in the moment that you can be with clients. And that may mean obviously being comfortable, uncomfortable certain times and working at different time zones, so on and so forth, sometimes having meetings at like 1 a.m., so on and so forth. You can just obviously set a boundary and say that this is not going to be a norm. But if such certain things like that happen and there is an emergency, feel free to do something like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the important things over here is that when people think about asynchronous communication, they actually take it in the wrong way. When you're starting out on a new project, when you're working in your first company or your first job, you should over communicate. You should take that time and invest your energy in really getting to know people. The other thing that I really struggle with, or I struggle to understand why people are really shy with their videos. If you're working physically somewhere, do you like how do you not like how do you cover your face, like what do you do, right? I mean, you have to be there. So end of the day, this is one of the biggest, I think, things that I see with university students. It's also a cultural thing, by the way. I have seen that a lot of our interns who are in the US and Canada, they're really confident, they're really good at networking, and then even people in Nigeria and Kenya, super confident, super lively. But then there are certain regions where I've seen people are super shy. And end of the day, I mean, you're trying to get a job, you're trying to kind of make a living here. So yeah, those are kind of really good thoughts. What are
One
some?
other thing, sorry,
Yeah.
one other minor thing I'd just like to highlight on that. A lot of people may be uncomfortable because they're not fluent in English. Like that usually happens sometimes, but I'm just going to let you know we have tons of people, more talented individuals than me in Mattermost that don't speak as fluently as me. We have leads in Mattermost who are at like one of the highest positions there, but they may not communicate fluently because they're from a different region. Their primary language is different. They probably know even more languages than most of the Europeans or Americans. But again, that does not have a bearing on you as a person. So you have to understand that just because you're fluent does not mean that you are successful or a great person, and that's just going to increase your possibilities of success. To a certain extent, it may, but it's very minimal, I would argue, because again, I've seen people who are extremely talented who may not be as fluent, but they are very successful in any, and you can actually see that in tons of organizations if you actually look at it. So don't be comfortable about your accent. It's not your primary language, and there's nothing to be shy about it.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up in a few minutes, and then take some questions from our audience. Feel free to add the question in the Q&A, and we're going to be answering those. But right now, what we want to focus on is a lot of our interns are going to be looking for their first jobs, and I think one of the things that they fail to understand is, and everyone, right? I mean, when we talk about design thinking, when we talk about user-centered approach, whether you're pitching to an investor, think from the investor's perspective. If you're applying to a company, think from the recruiter's perspective. So from a recruiter's perspective, what are some traits or skills that startups are looking for when they're hiring their first designers? And yeah, what's your take on that?
So yeah, I'll just mention that. So there are different things that I personally look for people, for designers in my own agency, and I know different organizations may have a different set or a different sort of a pattern as to what they're looking for. But there are obviously going to be certain things that are going to be very common. So as an example, if I'm looking for a freshie that I want to obviously onboard to my agency, or anyone's looking for any onboarding on any agency or a company or whatever it is, one thing that they're looking for is your portfolio. So the portfolio is going to be, it doesn't necessarily need to be actually live projects or actual client projects. They can be your own personal pet projects that you're really interested in. For example, if I don't like, there's an application called Bikea here. If I don't like a certain experience of the Bikea application in my own region, I can redesign that interface because I think there's a lack of ease, seamlessness, so on and so forth, and I can just improve that application and I can showcase that as my portfolio. I can design my own application and I can say that I personally think that this is a particular feature that was missing and I want to introduce this. So here's the design, this is the research that I've done, so on and so forth. So again, just have a portfolio based on the position that you're applying on and the things that you're interested in. If you're a visual designer, you obviously don't have to do a lot of research. Some research obviously is still beneficial, but if you're a visual designer, a UI designer, a web designer, just having really beautiful pages is going to help you secure that job, because people are going to know that you have the proficiency and you have that eye for certain, let's say, typography, for certain spacing adjustments, for white space, so on and so forth, illustrations, colors you use. They're going to get the idea that you have that sense that they're looking for and they can resonate with. If you're a UX designer, you can obviously show how you actually certainly move and actually talk to users, empathize with them, so on and so forth, and just communicate that. So again, that's one thing that I'm looking for, is that portfolio and a way for you to establish what you are and what you're doing and why you're proficient at it. So that's one. The other thing I'll just quickly mention is, once we onboard you, one thing that I'm looking for is communication. If you don't communicate and I'm just going to say, hey, we need to do this, like, can you do this? And you're going to be yes. And then I'm going to say, hey, do this, you're going to be yes. And if you just keep on doing that, that's not going to really help you. You need to ask questions. You need to be involved in the project. You need to care about the thing that you're working on. You just need to, you don't need to be a yes man. Like, even if I certain times like have a certain task on my designers under me, if they ask me questions or they challenge me, I like it because it tells me that they genuinely care about that particular product. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and definitely, I think that's one of the biggest things that I tell people as well. Like, that's my concern. Like when you're starting out a UX project, right? Ask questions. Ask, like, people who are stakeholders, like why we're doing what we're doing, right? The biggest, I think, one of the biggest differences between a great UX designer and an okay one is that when you're telling them the brief, an okay UX designer is going to be like, okay, this is good. Is that all? Are those all the things we need? And a great UX designer is going to be like, okay, I took some notes down, and you know what? This is what I was thinking. Tell me if I'm wrong. So they're actually going to add that recommendation, right? So a couple things, because we are kind of going over time, is when people, like, one of the biggest complaints people have, especially in the UX industry, is that we don't have experience. No one's going to giving us that opportunity. We've taken the Google course. We've also done this X boot camp. But then when they get their first opportunity, a lot of people struggle to actually utilize that. So what are some strategies, in your opinion, for maximizing your first UX job or internship once you actually get that opportunity?
So I think we've already covered this to some extent, but we can obviously talk about it more. Is obviously, once you actually land on that opportunity, that's your time to grow, right? You don't have to just, again, be confined in a silo and just be very passive about what you're doing, right? You have to be involved. You need to start getting involved in the project that you're actually involved in. You need to ask questions. You need to be in more touch with the stakeholders, so on and so forth. And you need to be more informed about it. If we're talking about just how to actually get in, Tala, again, like, I'm just going to ask that question because I'm not sure if I actually got that correctly. Can you rephrase that question?
Yeah, I mean, my question is, when people get their first internship, or their first job, how should they maximize their impact and, their learnings from that?
Yeah, work on different things. Like, again, if you think that certain things are not challenging to you, like, ask, like, hey, I think I've actually, like, done this particular thing, but I really want to explore some other avenues where I can grow as an individual. So you can actually ask your employer or the person that has hired you, or your manager, about certain opportunities and certain things that you're passionate about. Usually when you're starting out, you may explore certain projects, but you may not be interested in them. So you can explore them. If you're not interested, you can start with something else. You can ask them, hey, I'm really interested on this other thing that I've been exploring. Can you actually assign that to me as well? I would really love to do that. So don't be complacent, and just, again, try to be as open, as fluid, and try to just push yourself out of the comfort zone. I'll just say that. Push yourself out of the comfort zone, because that's where growth is going to happen.
Yeah. So I have a question on ethics, but we'll take that in a few minutes because we'll kind of close with that. So let's take some questions here from the audience. I think one of the questions is, what is your opinion on being a generalist designer versus someone who's more specialized in one thing, like UX research or UI or interaction design?
So, I mean, I would argue that in larger agencies, larger corporations, I'm pretty sure, like, a lot of people who are actually using these terms are actually fetching them from the Google certificate course, because I know they actually mention these terms. But usually when you're actually working in a smaller organization or even a larger organization like Mattermost, we usually rarely think about these terms or think about designers in these terms. Honestly, I'll just mention that. Usually because, again, in certain organizations, especially startups, designers usually have a lot of different roles that they have to run on. I am the only designer right now in boards. If you or anyone else was the only designer in boards, you're not going to just be a visual designer. Sometimes there are funds that are limited, right? You can't really scale. You can't have one person for UX research, one person for UI design, one person for web design, one person for graphic design. Like, there's not a possibility to do that. Though usually I would say graphic design is still, you can actually tell your client to actually hire a specific graphic designer. But when it comes to UI design, I think you cannot really take away some UX design aspects from any of the specific again projects or certain things. Like, you need to be informed on certain UX principles, and then you don't necessarily have to be a generalist and just be an expert in everything, but you can be a T-shaped designer. A T-shaped designer is, you have certain skills in a particular thing, but you also have a basic understanding of a lot of different things as well that actually your job requires you to have. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's, precisely what I was going to add too. All right. So the next kind of question a lot of people have, and I think I'm just going to rephrase the question that's here in the crowd, is that, I applied for this fintech company, but they rejected me because I didn't have relevant experience. What should I do? Where should I start? So what's your answer to something like that? I mean, when you're building a portfolio, how should you think about tailoring it if you haven't actually worked on, live project before?
So as I mentioned, again, if you're interested in a particular project, in something that you want to, again, improve, or you're interested in the fintech industry, start working on projects, just your own personal projects for that. Just start working on them. Start creating conceptual projects, start improving already existing fintech projects, start maybe sometimes even critiquing. Like, I don't necessarily mean it in a negative way, but positively critiquing certain things that exist in current fintech projects. A lot of the times, actually, what happens is when we see some agencies and some organizations, when they see a lot of contribution and a lot of passion coming in from certain people, certain community members, they even hire them. And that's what that's something that happens very frequently in Mattermost. So in Mattermost, if you have community members that are very engaged with the Mattermost project, then sometimes Mattermost is actually going to send them job requests, because we think that, again, these guys are really passionate about what they do and about their particular product. So I would say, again, even if you have rejection, don't really take it personally. It's never personal. It's just, again, like, sometimes a lot of people may even reject you and maybe dishonest about why they've rejected you. They're going to be like, again, you don't really have a lot of experience, but maybe they found another candidate, right? Or maybe they just for some reason ran out of resources or something, and they just don't want to say that. Like, when is an organization actually going to say, sorry, we've actually run out of resources, we had to replan how to reallocate the resources? A lot of the time that actually happens even in large organizations. So don't take it personally, and keep working on building yourself personally and your portfolio as well, and professionally as well.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's great advice. So the last question here really is, basically, as a UX designer, you have a lot of responsibility, right? Especially in the age of AI and machine learning. We're basically developing tools that are going to have a pretty big impact. I mean, we're already seeing the impact of, I'm not going to name companies here because we are developing a platform where we have employers. So I'm not going to name specific social media platforms, but you hopefully got what I was trying to say here, that are harming, basically causing more harm than good, right? And then also, there's this big thing around, addiction on phones, and basically there are a number of different kind of channels. But if you look at companies like Apple and Google, they are trying to make that initial kind of move right now to kind of improve that. So my question is, I mean, we've all read the book Hooked, right? We all know about kind of these kind of hooks that designers make in products. So what is your take on ethics in product design? How should designers be thinking about that? Yeah, please.
Sorry, I think I'm muted. I think that's going to be a larger topic, so I don't necessarily want to take too much time. If we actually have time afterwards, I can actually share a presentation, which I'm really passionate about as well. But I don't want to do that immediately. I think we can take questions before that if you want.
So we can actually go with that.
Okay.
I think, let me see if there are any valid questions here. Work for some startups and didn't document our process. Now I'm working on the portfolio and can't really hear them at all. What are your advice? Okay. I mean, you got to document your work. That's our advice. Make sure you document that. So we're going to have a short presentation here on ethics in UX design that Asaad gave in at Mattermost. So yeah, feel free to share your screen. Let me know if you have access. And let's kind of see that as we end this call today.
Sounds good. I actually do have access, so just give me a minute. I'm actually going to condense this presentation. I'm not going to give it exactly the way that I did it in Mattermost, because I obviously want to be cognizant of everyone's time. But we're going to talk about ethics in product design. And ethics in product design actually consider the moral implications of one work. Now, obviously, morality may be subjective for some, but I will treat this concern on the basis of objective morality. I argue there are objective moral values. I'm not going to read everything, but generally, we're going to assume that there is something good and then there is something bad. That's basically what it means. So there are certain ways in which obviously people actually design certain applications. So accountability is really important. Now, I'm going to talk about certain psychological principles that people exploit when designing certain applications. Now, I'm going to talk about operant conditioning. The American psychologist B.F. Skinner actually worked on an experiment with mice. So what he did was he actually created an experiment like this, where there was a rat trapped inside of a container. If he pressed a lever, there was actually a dispenser that threw out food, or that presented food to them. So what happened was, this was again like positive reinforcement. So what happened was, every time they pressed the lever, there was food. They pressed the lever, there was food. They actually got into the habit of learning that anytime they're going to press that lever, there's going to be food. So when they actually became full after eating the food, they would not obviously mess with the lever and only press it when they were hungry. So because they obviously know that this particular pattern actually works. So again, they're not going to be too much engaged about it. But what happened was he conducted another experiment where if they press the lever, the food may sometimes come out or it may not come out. So it was like, again, intermittent variable rewards. So again, you may get a reward sometimes if you're pressing a particular lever, but sometimes you may not get them. So what happened was this rat started behaving erratically. He just kept on pressing the lever because there was a certain uncertainty as to whether he's going to get that particular food or not, even when he was full. So the fact is that this particular concept of intermittent variable rewards is actually being used in our own applications to exploit users. And to anyone who's actually here, I don't want you to exploit users. I don't want you to exploit users for the benefit of your corporations, of your organizations. And I'm just going to show you how certain things and how this particular thing is actually being used. So example of this on humans can be seen even today on casinos. So casinos, as you can see, actually employ a very similar pattern. And then since we're talking about the digital age, we're going to talk about certain patterns like these on digital products. So as an example, we have these things, automated notifications. Sometimes, again, if you're not particularly hooked to an application, if you're not coming back to it, they're going to send you emails or they're going to send you automated notifications like friend suggestions. You aren't really, again, fascinated by on coming back to Facebook. They're going to send you a random friend notification. It's not going to be a notification that's generated by someone. They're going to automatically send it. So they're going to force you to actually come to it to see that particular notification and then start to obviously be addicted to that. And that happens in a lot of different places. Then we have the pull to refresh. So again, that pull to refresh functionality actually helps you be in control and pull just to see maybe you're going to receive something. Sometimes you may receive it, sometimes you may not receive it. So there's a certain uncertainty which actually allows users to be hooked to that as well. Then in games, we have loot boxes. Sometimes you're playing a game, you may actually start consuming these loot boxes, but you may not get the result that you want. So that actually forces you to behave erratically like the mice to keep on consuming or opening or finding these loot boxes, so on and so forth, just to get the reward that you're looking for. Because if you get the reward immediately, you're not going to be hooked on it. So they're going to use these patterns to actually keep you hooked to their application, even if you don't get a benefit of it. The rat at the very least was getting some food. What are you getting with these applications? I mean, come on. So again, we have to really be cautious about these things. So some other things, we have infinite loops promoting mindless consumption, infinite scrolling, right? We have that in Facebook and other applications, TikTok, so on and so forth. You have infinite looping videos. Infinite scrolling, you have an endless feed on LinkedIn, you have an endless feed on Facebook, on other applications. You just keep on scrolling mindlessly. There's no limit to it. There's no friction. And since there's no friction, there's no one to stop you, to actually force you to actually just take your mind off of that application and do something else. So you're taking away that time from users and you're promoting mindless consumption. Similarly, we have infinite looping videos. You keep on watching one video, whether it's on TikTok, Shorts, YouTube Shorts, or anything else. And just after that particular video ends, there's going to be an auto playing next video or a next episode, similarly on Netflix, right? It's automatically going to play. So you don't, again, make that decision yourself, whether you want to watch that next episode or not. It's automatically going to play, even if you make that decision or not. And this particular feature is automatically going to be on by default. If you want, you can turn it off, but it may be automatically on because it's going to engagement. It's going to increase engagement. And then obviously we have a very similar concept with dating apps as well. One other thing that people use are social affirmations. So it caters to our desires of belonging as social creatures. Again, we all are social creatures. We all want to belong in a certain community, because imagine if you get sick, who's going to take care of you? Our very survival depends on it. If I have a flu, let's say 104 degrees or something, I obviously can't go out. So inherently, from an evolutionary perspective, I have this particular desire to have people around me that follow me, or friends, so on and so forth, that actually like me, so on and so forth. But this particular social affirmations, this particular pattern that we're using, it limits our ability to be social. How many Gen Z people can actually go out and ask other people on a date or something, or just ask them to be their friends. They can send friend requests, but they can't really make people their friends just by talking to them. So again, we have these ideas of likes, followers, comments, subscribers, and they give you a dopamine hit and actually temporarily satisfy your sense of belonging, but it's a completely fake sense of belonging. It doesn't really help you in real life. It actually takes away from your ability to be a social creature, surprisingly, paradoxically. This is actually a comment from the former VP of growth from Facebook directly himself. We curate our lives around this perceived state of perfection. We get rewarded from short-term goals or short-term signals, hearts, like, thumbs up, and we conflate that with value and truth. And it's not obviously official value or truth. Imagine if you get sick and you have 10,000 subscribers or 50,000 subscribers. Who is actually first of all, that you're sick? And secondly, who is actually going to cook that meal for you? Or who's actually going to take care of you? Probably no one. Maybe if you have like 50 million followers or like something like Mr. Beast or something, then maybe there are going to be people who actually take care of you. But that's also going to be to a certain extent because of a reciprocal relationship with them. Usually, again, people aren't going to take care of you. Most of your friends on Facebook aren't going to take care of you until and unless there's a personal connection. Then we have other examples of features that applications have actually produced, but they have a huge effect on society. Photo filters. People are having an identity crisis because they are no longer comfortable in their skins. People are even having plastic surgeries to look like the filters because that's now what they attribute themselves as. If you keep on presenting an image of yourself that's not true and you're not comfortable with your own skin, then the more you play that image and the more you showcase that version of yourself, the more you're going to be aligned with that particular person, that fake person that you actually want to portray yourself as. And people, as a result, are actually having plastic surgeries to look like the person that they portray themselves as. Then we have, obviously, the scarcity principle. People are actually exploiting the need or the concept of scarcity, because obviously if something is scarce, it's valuable. So people, even though there's no limited time offer, they're falsely deceiving users that there are only a few items remaining in stock, or there are limited time offers and you need to actually purchase something, or you're gonna miss out on something. Then we have recommendations. I know I talked about recommendations in the future, but this is even more in depth. It's about taking the ability of people to make decisions for themselves and forcing certain decisions on them. Now, as I mentioned in these auto-playing videos, auto-playing channels, and all of that stuff, if certain decisions are being made for users, you're taking that particular ability from users to do those things themselves. Now imagine, lack of friction is not always good. The more we take away from a user's experience, whether that's time, whether that's any action that they're doing, whether that's a capability, the more they'll lose of that particular thing that we're taking away from them, right? This is a scene that I'm sure pretty much if you are comfortable, like, or familiar with. It's from The Matrix. So Neo asks Morpheus, like, why do my eyes hurt? And he's like, you've never used them before. So the less you use something, whether it's a physical thing or a physical body part or a sense, or it's your capability of doing something, you're going to lose that. So if you take away the decision-making power of users, they're going to lose the ability to make decisions, and obviously wise decision from themselves. They're not going to learn. If you're not going to learn to make good decisions for yourself, how do you think you're going to be a good decision maker in the future? Are you just going to get up from the bed one day and be a good decision maker? That's not going to happen. You can't be good at something that you are not comfortable with or you haven't done repeatedly. So in order to be good at something, you need to do it again and again. So again, that's extremely important. So how does friction help us? It gives users back their time. It allows them to be intentional. It avoids mindlessness, and it reinforces positive behavior. So again, if you actually stopped on something or stopped doing something that's actually taking a lot of your time, you're going to have a lot more time for yourself, for your family members, so on and so forth, and for even your productive growth as a productive member of society. So how can we tackle this crisis? I would argue we have to shift. We have to make a shift in perspective. We need to have better metrics of success. Not DAU, not MAU, not average session length. Now, how is the average session length as a metric going to help people on TikTok? If the metric of a product success is the average session length, like for TikTok or for YouTube or anything, the more people are going to spend time on that, is that really going to help these individuals who are actually spending time mindlessly consuming that product in the long run? It's going to be a detriment to society. It's not really going to help them. So again, we need to think about a more need-based, perhaps, metric of success. Does the user, or has this particular application fulfilled the need of the user? If it has, let the user go, give them back their time and let them be. Don't just force them to actually keep on consuming your application. Then we need to have meaningful connections instead of number of connections. We need to have a diverse team, because that's also going to have diverse perspectives on morality. And we need to stop moving fast and breaking things and be intentional in whatever you put out. The more you keep on pushing things out and the more you don't think about them, the more negative the consequences can be, because you haven't even thought about the consequences that that particular product or feature is going to have. So again, we have to build technology that augment the user experience instead of replacing it with virtual interactions and reward, and just make them feel that, for example, this is something valuable, which it actually isn't. So that's pretty much it. Again, I don't really want to take too much time, but I think I've already taken a lot. So
all right. No, that was definitely interesting and useful. And I think that's an important thing to kind of remember, because if you look at what's been happening in the last kind of 20, 30 years, technology has actually created more kind of divisions and more inequities than it's actually kind of improved. And I think with basically web 3.0 with kind of industry 4.0, we have that big opportunity. And as UX designers, we really have to kind of understand the opportunity to kind of build ethical solutions that are really kind of thinking about these things. But yeah, it's been really, really amazing to hear from you, Asaad, and would definitely love you on the platform sometime to actually talk about these things in more detail, especially the freelancing part. And thank you so much for joining in, and it's definitely been an amazing experience.